Okay, then we have our modern translations. We've got the Jewish translation, Stone's, JPS. There are many others. We've got others, the New World Translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses. We've got the Mormon translations. We've got the Christian ones, which there are hundreds of. And then we have our Messianic ones, the Complete Jewish Bible, the Restoration Scriptures, the Hebrew Roots Version. Okay, there's a lot of English translations. I know somebody's eventually going to ask me this question, so I'm going to answer it now. I get this in email a lot, and every time I speak, I always get asked the same question, so I know. What is the best translation to use? How many here were thinking that? They were going to ask me that. Yeah, I knew that. Huh? Use multiple translations. Use the Hebrew. Forget translations. No. Well, that's my recommendation, yes. Learn Hebrew so you can read it in its original language. But if you're not able to do that, not willing to do that, that's okay. Let me first preface, and I always do this in my emails when I get asked this question. Let me first say that every modern translation of the Bible is from a Western perspective. I think we all can see that now and understand that, right? With that said, which is the best translation that does a pretty good job of translating, in my opinion, is the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. It has its problems, but in most cases I find that it's a very good translation from a Western perspective. But it is also important to compare other translations because not one translation is the best. Okay, so how many of us have compared? I'll get out my King James, I get out my RSV, my NIV. We get out all our, we do our word studies here and our translation studies. Make sure we got the right one. How many of us have done that? Yeah, that's fun, isn't it? Did you know you've now biased your understanding from a Christian perspective? Translators are very biased. But all the translations are all Christian translations. That's a real problem. Because you're going to get a translator who's a Christian, his opinion, and we're going to get more into this on how that happens and what happens. You're getting his opinion of what that text is saying from a Christian perspective. So what should you do? What? Well, learn Hebrew. Yeah, that's probably the best. The second best thing is, it's very obvious, very simple. What? Use it. Well, okay, there you go. You can get this too. That's good. You can use this and compare this with this because now you're going to get from a messianic perspective in his biasness. Now, if you do compare a passage with this and you find out there's a big difference, you know there's biasness going on somewhere. Then you're going to want to study it a little closer and figure out which one is being right and which one's wrong. But what else can you do? Go up here. Get the Jewish. To be honest with you, the Hebrew is their language. It's their Torah. They're the ones who have been preserving it for these 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. It's their book. They know it. They memorize it. It's their language. If anybody can do a fairly good job of translating, I think they could do a pretty darn good job. Are they going to have some bias? Oh, yeah. You betcha. But it helps you if you compare the Christian with the Messianic, with the Jewish, and get these Bibles out. Now when you find a difference, you're going to find some differences and you're going to know there's some bias there. The translation that I'm working on, the mechanical translation, is probably the best way of eliminating biasness because I'm not translating verses. I'm translating words, prefixes, and suffixes, and they're translated exactly the same way every time. So when it comes to a word like Alma, it's going to be translated the same way there as it is in any other place that it's found. Do animals have a soul? Now here we're going to get into some problems with translations. I'm going to take a poll here. How many of you think animals have souls? Okay, how many of you say animals do not have souls? A few. So anyway, we have this debate going, do animals have a soul? Did you know that in the Hebrew that there cannot even be a debate? It's impossible to have that because the Hebrew very clearly tells you whether or not the animals have a soul. Genesis 1:27 says, I don't remember which translation this is, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures. It's probably the RSV. Okay, here it is in the Hebrew. Vayomer Elohim totze haaretz nefesh chaya. Notice the two in yellow there. Nefesh chaya. Remember that, okay? Now, let's take a look at the next verse. Bereshit 2:7. And man became a living soul. Some translations have being. Okay, in Hebrew that is, Vayahi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. Does that sound familiar? Does it look familiar? But look at that right there. Is that the same as that? Identical. There's no difference. So if we translate this as a soul of the living or living soul, what should we translate this as? A living soul. If we're going to translate this as a living creature, what should we translate this as? Right. The translators, they fixed the text for you. Because they know you guys are stupid. Okay? And they say, you know what, these guys, they can't understand these things, so we're going to fix it for them. Okay, yeah. That's the debate. But is that even a Hebraic concept? We talked about the soul yesterday. What is the soul? The mind, will, the emotions, the heart. The whole of you. That's the soul. It includes the body. It's the whole thing. The body, the flesh, the blood, the organs, the breath, the character, everything. The whole embodiment of who you are. Okay, here we have the King James Version. The voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve. Now here we have it in the NIV, I think. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks. Oh boy, okay. Why do we have the same verse? They're both working from the same Hebrew, and one translates it one way and one a completely different way. But let's take a look at what it has in the Hebrew. Kol Yahweh Yecholel Ayelot. This word, cholel, the root is the chet, the lamed, and the lamed, halal. This word literally means to pierce something. The picture in Hebrew is a drill. A drill. Even in our modern culture, think of a... When you go to drill something, you're piercing a hole through something, correct? In ancient times, they used a bow drill with a stick, with a little flint, drill bit, and a bow. Same concept, same difference. What's the hardest part about starting to drill something? Getting it started, the beginning of it, is always the hardest part. Now, this word halal means to pierce, but it's also translated as to begin. It means to begin something. But it's also translated as to profane. And this makes it difficult in some translations. You might remember in a verse in Genesis where it says, and they began to call on the name of the Lord. Everybody remember that? Some translations say they profaned the name of the Lord. That's because it's the same Hebrew word. Profaning is the sense you're drilling through, you're piercing someone. If I profane you, I pierce you in Hebrew thought. Or is it saying I'm beginning to drill a hole, so it actually means begin. Context will usually help you, but sometimes the context isn't enough to tell you. So some translations will say he profaned the name of the Lord. Some translations say he began to call on the name of the Lord. One or the other. We don't know sometimes. You have to sometimes make a judgment call on which one's correct. So there are going to be differences in translations. This was literally saying, kol is a word for voice. The voice of Yahweh, he pierces. The yah in front means he. He pierces